compassion, awareness, and wisdom. I know we have so many different teachers and different lineages. Even within Buddhism, there are hundreds and hundreds of them. And they're all teaching, they're teaching something different. Or it seems as though they're teaching something different. And so I think in the beginning it's a good idea to get the core teaching of Buddhism, and then that makes a lot more sense of everything else that's being taught. There is the briefest synthesis of the entire Buddhist teachings are called the Four Noble Truths. And everything that was the very first talk that he gave in Deer Park in India after he was awakened. And it laid the foundation for the entire Buddhist teaching into the future. And it's called the Four Noble Truths, or the Four Truths. And what's interesting about it is that every sutra and of every lineage that has followed illustrates one of those Four Noble Truths. So that really makes it a hub teaching, like a Mandelic hub teaching. Some of the teachings that the Buddha gave were just a lot about suffering. What is suffering? Other talks he gave are what actually causes suffering. We know there's suffering, but what causes it? And the emphasis is always enlightenment, or in the Buddhist word, Nirvana, peace. There is a possibility for the ending of suffering. We were talking about the mental one, the voices in the head, the story that's always going on in the mind. And yes, I suppose there is a stage where that does actually stop. And it is called, there is something that's called arahata, and that's equivalent to a Buddha. And that means it's a perfected being, and that is the end of practice. That's the end of that's the ideal state, the state of peace. But prior to that, there's a long journey, or a short one, depending on the individual. So the Four Noble Truths are and different. It can be presented in different ways. Also, there's a very formal way of presenting it, and there's a more informal way. We'll do the informal way first, just so you can set it in the mind. Okay. There's disease, dis-ease. There's a cause for disease. Okay? And if there is a possibility of getting rid of disease, there has to be remedies. And the remedies are called the Eightfold Path. So in the more formal way of presenting that teaching, it would be there's suffering, okay, and there's a cause for that suffering, and there's an end to the suffering, and there's a path leading to the end of suffering. The suffering is described as birth is suffering. It's certainly suffering for the mother, and they say it's suffering for the new being coming in also. It's quite a shock. So birth, aging, old age, sickness, and death are suffering. And being attached to, being conjoined with something that you don't want is suffering. And losing something that you do want, being separated from something that you do want, is also suffering. And in short, the entire of the human existence is suffering. And in Buddhism, they actually believe that there is absolutely no happiness whatsoever here. Right? No. in this life. I had arguments with my teachers about this, but I have since come to still question that.
I'm not going to argue with you on that one.
Well, the thing is that the reason behind it in the Buddhist viewpoint and from a monk's viewpoint, a practitioner's viewpoint, is every happy state, every beatific state, no matter how beautiful it is very, very impermanent, and there is a clinging and there's a suffering of being separated from it. So they do say that although there might be a temporary balance, a temporary happiness, that built into it because of its very impermanent nature, in that sense is going to cause a bit of suffering, or unsatisfactory. It's unsatisfactory would probably be a better word. The original word is dukkha, and it's really, really hard to translate some of the ancient language into a single English word. And there's been attempts of using different words, like unsatisfactory is another word that works well. Of interest, in the inside of the order, they refer to dukkha is not as so much as suffering or unsatisfactory, but they refer to it as the feeling of being trapped in a rock cave with no exit and very little air. It's a different way of working with language, more like the feeling of the entrapment than an intellectual definition of it with a list of aging, old age, sickness, and death. The second noble truth, so that defines what the problems are. And those are real problems, and they are universal. There is no one, I don't think there's anyone that escapes any of those first group of sufferings. There could possibly be a question about sickness. Apparently in some of the forms of the first noble truth, sickness is left out. There evidently was one bhikkhu who was the Buddha's friend who was never sick in his entire life and died. So it is questionable about that, But there's very few people that go by without stubbing their toe or having a toothache or some problem with the physical body. The cause for this problem in the Four Noble Truths is called tanha, clinging. And it's simply put, it's trying to make what is impermanent permanent. The whole kind of work that we do, we have to feed ourselves, but in a sense, the excess accumulation and wanting of objects is another form of the clinging. There is, overall, we would say that it is the trying to make what is impermanent permanent. But if we want to get more specific, there is the type of clinging, or the search, or the constant work for getting the right feeling in the body. And it has a lot to do with getting the right clothes, having the right girlfriend, having the right complexion, having the right body, having the right iPhone, having the good job, having the money, having the house. There's this constant pressure on us from advertising in society and the right song, the right music. It's interesting that rock and roll lasts. A singer lasts for 3 or 4 years, and a top one tune is good if it goes for 3 or 4 weeks, and it's worn out, and you want a new one again. People get a new tune, they listen to it, and after about 10 or 15 or 20 times, then it's just sort of goes away. So, kind of built into our human body, and the reason that we are incarnated here in this body, there's a karmic propensity toward the saturation of the senses is this human realm. That's its primary advantage. That's why people come here. That's why we're drawn here. Is it has this really, really wide range of sensual objects that we can saturate all the senses with and work with the mind. So that in one sense that's good because it's not too great here that we don't ever. We are constantly reminded that there are some severe problems that need to be addressed, both always in the environment and in our own being. So it's not too good that we can't forget. It's not too bad that we can't get up some free time and have some space to do some study and exploration. So it's a nice balance point. But most people, I would say, almost everyone, is involved with saturating the senses, and have been as far as back in history as I have read. And there's another type of clinging that has to do with the first point that we talked about, trying to make what is impermanent permanent. And we are constantly trying to basically project ourself as we are into infinity. There's a great fear of us not being here, and there's a lot of effort being put into, and the view that somehow we are going to, in a year we're going to be here in the teaching, we're going to have these teachings, we're going to be progressing, we're going to have these attainments, and we're going to move on. Or if it's in business, you see yourself, you're projecting yourself into the future, a view of yourself moving into the future. That pretty much determines that kind of freezes that being and makes a certain karmic flow. And the third type of clinging that people get into is they instead of wanting to continue indefinitely into the future, they actually want it to stop. And that's called the annihilation view. So we have the sensual quality of saturating the instantaneous sensing, sensual enjoyment. We have the eternalist view, clinging to the eternalist view, and clinging to the annihilation view. Like people who are sick or are very depressed, they want to end it all. They want to annihilate it all. And that becomes, in the practice itself, that becomes an interesting observation, because when you're doing your anapanasati or you're doing your meditations, sometimes you'll want it to continue on. You just want it to keep going and going and going. Other times you can't stand it. You want it to end. So in a kind of a mini example of eternalism and annihilation are how you actually feel physically. It has to do with how you feel physically. The third noble truth is the possibility of the release from suffering, and that's the goal of the Buddha's path. It's called Nirvana. There's a lot of reference to enlightenment in the Buddhist teaching, but it's really not in the vocabulary of the Buddhist teaching, enlightenment. It is used occasionally throughout the scriptures, but it's never been considered the goal of the teaching. That was, enlightenment is from the age of enlightenment. Our early translations from Buddhist literature were done by European philosophers, and the closest that they could see that the Buddhist teaching was aiming for was the enlightenment of the 16th century, the age of enlightenment. So they used that word for the goal of Buddhism, but really no one actually knows what enlightenment means. And peace is a better, more easily identifiable word than enlightenment. Peace. instead of turmoil, instead of constant building. There's a peace in the being. And the fourth noble truth is called the Eightfold Path, and that's the real heart of the Buddhist teaching. The methods that you can bring about peace, or we can say enlightenment, but peace is better. And those eight steps in the Buddha's path are divided into three different groups. It's the wisdom group, the morality group, and the contemplative group. We would call that meditation, although that's a German word also that doesn't really apply to Buddhism very accurately. But it has become the word to use. Now, wisdom is something that it has to do with, it is right thought and right view and right thought. And it is the end product of the path, but they list it first because you have to have some idea of what it is that you're trying to accomplish before you even start. So although you can't actually have right view is also usually translated as, not usually, it's usually translated as right view, opposed to having the wrong view. Sometimes it's translated as total view, opposed to partial view. And so the idea that the view should be that you understand the Four Noble Truths, that is actually the realization of peace, will come with the understanding of the seeing into and experiencing fully the Four Noble Truths. And right thought would have to be what also comes about from a transformation in the depth of the being. And it would be that you have a total compassion for all living beings. There would be no other alternative with a total awakening. The second set of the Eightfold Path have to do with morality, and it means right speech, right view, right speech, right action, and right livelihood. And sila is a very interesting word because it actually means cool.
What was the word?
Sila, S-I-L-A, sila. And it means cool, a cool consciousness, opposed to a person that is immoral, not moral. There's a burning consciousness. There's lots of activity in the mind's always busy. Now, the sila, the right speech is that you should train yourself largely by the environment you're in. It really helps with sila, that you have elders that are a very good example, that do not use harsh speech. They don't gossip. They don't badmouth people. They don't, they don't lie. They talk, sensible talk. They're talking talk that will actually lead a person to more intelligence, not just circular thinking and gossip. So right speech is quite an important feature to develop in your life, because it will cause you not to be in states of turmoil. If you have enemies, or if you are speaking badly about a person behind their back, or to their face, or behind their back, that builds barriers. That doesn't allow that person, to change. You try and keep them fixed as a bad person. That's not wholesome. Everyone is doing their best to stay in a good place, even though they may be going about it in the wrong way. The next thing is the actions, and that is that you physically you're respectful of the people around you. You clean up behind yourself. You are quiet. You don't interrupt people when they're doing stuff. You might help a person on the street to cross the street if they can't do it, or anything that has to do with your actions being wholesome. And the right livelihood is really, really critical for our age, for people involved in Buddhism. A monk's life is actually quite ideal, but a lay person, really, that's going to be a major stumbling point in their spiritual path work, because they're going to have to do it their entire life. So we need to get a job that's good, a good job. And what they list is in the negatives, they list the bad jobs. They should never deal in armaments or drugs, including alcohol. Dealing in prostitution.
And when you say armaments, that you're talking about armor as in war? Or?
Yeah, rifles, guns, bullets, dynamite mines, all that.
Or anything that would support that, like making...
Yeah, just stay out of that. Just that is not a... There are other choices. You don't have to go in that direction. It's a choice you have to make. The drugs is obvious. I grew up in and around that environment, and I don't know of any dealer that isn't super paranoid. They're just wired, don't even like to pick up the phone, God. And so that isn't a very comfortable way to live. It isn't very, very settled. And the prostitution is another one that's really, really bad. And one that we don't think much about that is considered really not a good livelihood is called usury. Now, and that is money lenders. Now, it might be questioned that banks, the banking system, presently the interest rates on my line of credit are like 8.25%, and I feel that's reasonable. That in a strict sense, even that would be called usury. But in the day of the Buddha, and in most cases, money lenders actually charge like 50 to 80% on their loan, and it could be for a month, or 2 months, or 3 months. In other words, you are lent $50,000 for 2 months, and you are charged $25,000 interest. That's called usury. And most money sharks, money lenders operate like that. That's very, very, very high interest rates like that. And that's what's generally referred to as usury. Important to stay away from those areas to make a livelihood, because they always cause upset. They always cause upheaval, which sila means quiet, cool. And so sila, then the cool, is the foundation for meditation, for mental cultivation. You gotta have that before you go into the hall. Or you don't have to have it, but it's going to be really hard to practice, to be steady, if you're going to be constantly in an upheaval. It's going to push you around. And then the contemplative side, the last three of the Eightfold Path, are right effort, right concentration, and right mindfulness. Probably right mindfulness first, right effort, right concentration. And it's actually really important to understand that category is called samadhi. Samadhi. Those three together are called samadhi. Mindfulness is the ability to stay with something for an extended period, moment to moment, attention to what is occurring. And that would be the reason that you would be given, say, anapanasati to do, or lifting and moving and placing. The exercise is to develop a continuity of attention. And most of your practices that are base practices have to do with contact with the physical body, because that's the easiest. The second part of this is called right effort, and this is something that most people really fall down on. I don't understand that you should make corrections when you're practicing. Right effort means that you recognize when something is off in your practice. You recognize when the mind is wandering, or you're in a state of hatred, a state of greed, and you make an effort. You make an effort to correct it. You do something about it. And if a wholesome state is arisen in your practice, say you're really concentrated and you feel really well, you make an effort to continue that good state for as long as you can. So if it's bad, you learn to get rid of it in some way. You apply some method to your practice. Say if you're sleepy, there are ways of waking yourself up, but it really requires effort. It requires tremendous effort, because when you get a dull mind in your practice, you don't feel like doing anything. You have to learn to raise the energies up, and there are ways that we can suggest that will help, but you have to do it, and that requires effort. We've got techniques, but the effort has to be supplied by the individual. And we have to then avoid what it is that causes a problem. If you really have trouble with staying awake in your practice, you have to look at how much you eat. Overeating is one reason why you can be droggy, eating too much. The digestive process really makes the mind dull. Oversleeping, also, sleeping too much makes the mind dull, makes the whole body dull. And there's usually an example given at this point of the right effort in outside of a meditation hall, and how you learn to live a more wholesome life. And it's they use the example of an alcoholic, and so right effort would have to do in the future. You learn to avoid the situations which cause an unwholesome state to arise. And so an alcoholic then is driving down the road and is really, really thirsty for some water, and it would not be good for the alcoholic to go into a bar to get a glass of water. You learn to avoid the situations that cause you to be in unwholesome states. And that's outside of the meditation hall, but in particular inside of the meditation hall, you have to learn to do what it was that caused you to be in a good state, and continue doing that, and eliminate those conditions that caused you to be in a negative state. And the third is the concentration. Concentration is called samatha, calm. And that has to do with the jhana that we were speaking of, I think 2 nights ago. Jhana is a very deep state of concentration, and it is not freedom, but it is liberation. It is not complete release from suffering, but it is a temporary settling of all the building and flurry and anxieties and worries they do settle in this altered state of consciousness called an ecstatic bliss jhana, ecstatic bliss. And it's a really very beatific state, even in the lowest level of the jhanas. That's also an essential part of the samadhi, the mental cultivation of meditation. Now the exercise you're given in meditation are varied, but those three ingredients are all the foundation for doing any practice. You have to have all three. You have to have the ability to stay with your practice and develop a continuity of attention. You have to recognize and make remedies when unwholesome conditions arise. You should be able to recognize wholesome conditions when they arise and do what you can to keep them continually, cultivate them, keep them happening. And you need to be able to develop these jhanas, these very, very wholesome states. All three of those go together. And that's what makes meditation work. Not the practice that you're giving, but how you work with it. Okay, that finishes the Four Noble Truths, the suffering, the origins of suffering, the possibility, the ending of suffering, and the path that leads to the end of suffering. That's the core teaching of the Buddhist path.